I understand that you might be beginning to look at this. And the amount of people that say, Barbara, I've got this, and there's this great big long fancy name. Have you noticed they're giving things really fancy names now? And I don't know what their reason is for giving these fancy names. And one name was incredibly long, and I Googled that. Heavy bleeding. You see, when anyone is sick, the first thing you look at is the history, because we are what we are today because of our history. And then symptoms, and especially tomorrow we're going to be looking at natural remedies, a whole lot of things that you can do to bring relief to symptoms. And then you look at the body's response, because response tells you you're on the right track or you're not. It's much simpler than most people realise. And when some people tell me their history and what's happening to them today, you know what I say? No wonder. No wonder. When you have a look at all the things that came together to cause this. It's like lung cancer. Do you smoke? Oh, I haven't smoked for 30 years, but how long did you smoke? Oh, 50 years. You see, it took its toll. And the body can heal itself as long as you give it the right conditions. And the body is also very forgiving. I'm constantly amazed at how bodies respond once they're given the right conditions. So before we begin, let us say a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for bringing us here today. Thank you so much for a body that has the ability to heal itself. Thank you that it bears so long when we don't give it the right conditions. And thank you that you wink at our ignorance. We pray now that you'll teach us and guide us this morning, and we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Even medicine acknowledges that diabetes is a lifestyle disease. Am I talking about type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes? I find that the same conditions all respond to, whether it be type 1 or type 2. It's basically a pancreas is not working well. And so if the pancreas is not working well, we need to go to our 3-letter word and find out why. But what happens when a 7-year-old girl has diabetes? She hasn't been on the planet long enough to be giving the body the conditions that would wear out a pancreas. So then we need to go back and look at parents and even grandparents. We had a 9-year-old girl do our program. She had diabetes. And of course, as a child, it's considered type 1 diabetes. And also medicine considers that type 1 diabetes cannot be reversed. Yep. But type 2 can be reversed. So I began to investigate, and the little girl had been vaccinated. And I have seen a few children develop diabetes after vaccination. But there are many children who are vaccinated, but they don't have diabetes. It's one of the factors. And there are many factors that can come together to create a certain condition. And then I consulted with her mother, because her mother was doing the program too. And her mother was very, very large. Her mother was only as tall as me, but she was about 3 times my size. And as I'm consulting with her, she was telling me her lifestyle and what she did, and nothing terribly remarkable. Then the little girl said, "Mum, tell her." And the mother looked a little embarrassed. And the little girl said, "Mum, you've got to tell her." And the mother looked very embarrassed again. So the little girl said, "She eats a bag of candies a day." A bag of candies. We call them lollies. Do you call them candies?
Yes.
They're sort of sweet things. They're sugar. And people suck on them, apparently. Lollipops. Do you call them lollipops? The one stick? How can I say to that mother that years and years and years of eating so much sugar has worn her pancreas out to the point that it has compromised her pancreatic DNA, and she's given a compromised pancreatic DNA to her child. Now, I don't have to tell her that, because as she hears the lectures, her heart is struck. And many times I've had to say to mothers, don't beat yourself up over this. You did not know. You did not know. And many are sick through ignorance. And as people listen to the lectures, they start to see where maybe different things may have contributed to what's happening to them. But they also, and I'm sure it's happening to you, think about their family members, their neighbours, and they think, I think this would help, or I think this. But do you know that you can't go and tell them, is that right? You can't. In fact, it's the hardest thing when you discover the amazing fact that our body can heal itself when it's given the right conditions, not to run and tell everyone you know. And what will they label you as? A bit of a fanatic. Do you know your best message is your life? That's your best message. And when people say, you're looking good, what's happened? You can say, I'm so glad you asked. That's the best message that you can give. Because there are so many different messages out there. And so many people watch the television. And it's very hard to turn the television off once it's on. And the ads, wow, some of the messages, they're not true. They're not true, but when something is given enough, the brain is such that it actually starts to think it must be true. But that's why God says, I've not given you the spirit of fear, power, love, and a sound mind. A sound mind assesses all the evidence. All the evidence. So I'm going to present the evidence this morning. And we're first of all going to go to the CBD, the Central Business District of the human body, which is the inside workings of the cell. The glucose goes in, it goes through a 20-step pathway. How does the glucose get into the body? Here's our pancreas, and our pancreas releases hormones that balance our blood glucose levels. And one hormone that's released is insulin. Insulin's the hormone that gets the blood sugar level down. And there's another hormone that the pancreas releases. It's called glucagon. And that's the hormone that gets the blood sugar level up again. So these two hormones are released by the pancreas to balance, maintain our blood glucose levels. And when we're eating food that little by little delivers a constant, steady supply of glucose, we've got a very happy pancreas. A little bit of insulin here, a little bit of glucagon there. That's great. But when we eat food that gets the blood sugar level up very high, very fast, it's almost like the pancreas is getting screamed out, quick, it's too high, release the insulin. High glucose demands high insulin. So the insulin's released, but because so much insulin's released, now the blood sugar level goes too low. And now the brain says, oh no, we're too low, stop the insulin, release the glucagon to get it back up again. But when the person's blood glucose levels go low, it's called hypoglycemia. Person's feeling a bit dizzy. Why? Because the brain cells consume 15 times the glucose of any other cell. And the brain can only hold a 2-minute supply of glucose. Have you noticed when someone puts on weight, their head doesn't get bigger? There's a skull there. Only so much can be stored. So when blood glucose levels drop down, it only takes 2 minutes before brain's not working. I need a hit, I need a lift, I need a pick-me-up. But inside the body, glucagon's being released, but the person's feeling a bit woozy, so they grab for more sugar. Does that get them up? Oh yes, very fast. But now the whole cycle begins. Oh no, we're too high, quick, release it. Oh no, we're too low. Do you know what eventually happens to pancreases? They just wear out. They're sick of this. I'm against animal abuse, I'm against child abuse, and I'm against pancreatic abuse. But you know, the greatest deception is people are doing it and they don't know they're doing it. Isn't that what deception is? Not as it seems. And there was an ad in Australia, I don't know if it's still on the television, but it had a teaspoon of sugar and it had beautiful country scenes and sugarcane plants in the background, and the white sugar was being poured out, and the slogan said, "Sugar, a natural part of life." Eeh. That's like saying, getting white powder on a spoon and tipping it out with poppy plants in the background, saying, "Cocaine, a natural part of life." Eeh. Be careful of these deceptions. It's like going shopping with the little one, and the little one's been watching television and there's been an ad on. And notice the ads, they're directed to children at children time. Cereal, and the child sees the cereal in the supermarket, "I want," and the mother says, "We're not having that, it's full of sugars." Where? Child falls on the ground. And then the parent has a choice. They have to quickly leave. They're a bit embarrassed. Or they put their cereal in the basket and child immediately stops. I'll tell you, it's blackmail. Yeah. That's why be very careful what's going into your children's heads. It's revealed in the supermarket, isn't that true? Without us even realising what's going into their head. So when the glucose goes into the cell, it goes into the cell under the action of insulin. Insulin's the key that unlocks the door to get the glucose in the cell. But on the high carbohydrate, high sugar diet, with so much glucose coming in, the cell basically says, "We've already got enough." So insulin resistance begins. You've heard of insulin resistance? Insulin resistance usually is the start of diabetes. Insulin resistance happens. So it resists insulin, so the glucose can't get in, so the glucose is floating through the blood. The brain sees it and starts screaming at the pancreas, "More insulin," because that's what it thinks. Look at all the glucose in the blood. We need insulin to get it in the cell. Not realising that on the cell wall, there's insulin resistance. Can you see the problem? And the pancreas is getting screamed at more and more and more and more and more. And what's the body going to do with all this glucose in the blood? It'll come out in the urine. Diabetes mellitus means sweet urine. It's got to get rid of it some way. So it starts coming out there. Meanwhile, the pancreas is wearing out. And the person starts drinking huge amounts of water. That's one of the first signs, huge amounts of water, because they're losing the glucose in the blood, and there's too much glucose in the blood, and the body realises it's got to water this down, and then this vicious cycle begins. Did you know that there's no mention of diabetes in Hippocrates' writings? And Hippocrates was 400 years BC. So 400 years BC, sugar was not being refined. It was really only when sugar started to be refined in London, and only wealthy people could afford the refined sugar, that doctors started to see glucose in their wealthy patients' urine, and it was called diabetes mellitus. So let's continue the journey of glucose. It goes through the 20-step pathway. The 20-step pathway gives 2 units of energy. The end result of the 20-step pathway is a chemical form of glucose called pyruvate. And pyruvate, as the chemical form of glucose, gets fed into the next section in the cell. It's the 8-step pathway, and this 8-step pathway gives us an impressive 36 units of energy because of the presence of oxygen. This pathway, no oxygen. what a difference oxygen makes. We looked at that last night. We looked at that a few times. We looked at it in relation to conquering cancer. But now we're looking at the whole cycle of glucose in relation to diabetes. So on this high glucose, high sugar, high carbohydrate diet, so let's define the carbs, and we defined them yesterday. There's your bread and cereal, and how many Americans and Australians woke up to these every morning, and doesn't take you very far, so the cakes, pretzels, donuts, cookies, everything start to come out. And when a child says, I'm hungry, it touches the mother heart because, you know, the mother is the nourisher for the child, and so she often will give her. And I'll tell you what, it keeps them quiet for a minute while they're eating it. But that's often where the diabetes begins. Also pizza, pasta, the high carbohydrate foods. And potato is in there too, and I'll show you why in a minute. And then, of course, the pure crystallized acid extracted from the sugarcane plant is the other carb. Many people today are living on the high carbohydrate diet. We looked at that previously in relation to how I don't think anyone chose to eat that way. It's just there. It's just fast. And when you live way out on the farm, this is not fast food. When you've got to make this takes a long time. What's fast food down on the farm? There's your fruits and vegetables. Apple straight off the tree in the mouth. I was at Lizette's yesterday. Plum off the tree, can be eaten immediately. There's your fast food. But in the towns and in the cities, this is the fast food. And because down on the farm, where you're making all your own food, this is not fast food. It's almost the message from nature is bit less. And when I was reading the history of Italy, do you know, traditionally Italians lived on thick minestrone stews and soups. And the pizzas and the pastas were like special occasions. And I can understand that. Great big pot of stew on the stove, it can be just popping away all day, but it takes a bit of work to make the pasta and the pizza. A lot of Americans and Australians think the Italians live on pasta and pizza every day, but it's actually, traditionally, it wasn't quite like that. In her book, Gut and Psychology, Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride, she looks at the history of many nations. And she said, do you know that traditionally many people lived on these thick stews? They were just quick, they were just easy. And the people could come in from work and there it was, nice big hearty stew. And the mother in the kitchen, she's got work to do. She's got to scrub the floors and scrub the clothes and So maybe on a special occasion, my granddaughters, my 18-year-old granddaughters just had graduation a couple of weeks ago. I was there. My daughter and I got up at 4:30. We cooked all morning. And the people started coming up too. You do that for special occasions. But I'll tell you what, I'm not interested in doing that every day. So this high carbohydrate diet, it causes a release of high glucose. And number one, the glucose is sent into the cell, into the energy cycles. But we've still got a lot of glucose left over, so now it's stored like a little bunch of grapes. And they're quick-release glucose stores. These quick-release glucose stores are called glycogen. And this is the fuel that you used this morning on your morning walk, was your glycogen stores. That's why you don't eat before you exercise. Otherwise you'll have trouble because, 1,200 calories are required to digest a meal, and when you're exercising, the muscles are saying, we need it, and the stomach's saying, we need it. But if you exercise on an empty stomach, all the energy can go to your muscles to exercise. All you need to do is to ensure that you drink water. But on the high carbohydrate diet, still got lots of glucose left over, and now it's stored as fat. And what's happening on this high carbohydrate diet in America, in Australia? Do you know Australia's taken over America? 63% of Australians are either obese or overweight on this high carbohydrate diet. And so what's happening today with diabetes is that not only is the pancreas being worn out because of the high carbohydrate diet, but also many diabetics are carrying excess weight because this constant high glucose, insulin's got a one-set mind. It's I must store, I must store, I must store. I must get that glucose out of the blood and into storage. Oh, the energy cycles are full. The glycogen, it must all go to here, all go to here. See, fat doesn't make you fat. It's this excess glucose storing as fat. But something else is happening. And I want to point out the grain that bread is made out of, the majority of breads, majority of cereals, cakes, biscuits, cookies, pretzels, donuts, the pizza, the pasta. It is all made out of one grain, predominantly, and that is wheat. And in the 1950s, Dr. Norman Bulag and a team of scientists in Mexico were crossbreeding wheat. You see, they wanted to produce a plant with a high yield of grain to save the starvation crisis, and no one objects to that. Well, no one objects to a want to help with the starvation problem, but you can't improve on God. So they put the wheat through intensive crossbreeding, and they finally came up with a plant that had a heavy yield of grain. Now, traditionally, wheat has always grown 6 foot high. And before the grain was fully developed, the stalk broke. It was just too heavy. So they went back to the drawing board. This is over many years. They started in the 50s. It wasn't until the 1970s that they'd finalised their product. Now the wheat grows this high. Have you noticed? It only grows 2 foot high. It's got a thick stem so that it can hold the heavy yield of grain. And some farmers are testifying they're getting 6 to 8 times more grain per acre. Oh, they love it. They've got to pay their bills. So I think it was 1976, Dr. Norman Bulag got a Nobel Prize for his hybridised wheat. Because it was just wheat, they did not think they had to do any safety studies. It was rushed through with no safety studies. Sounds like something else, doesn't it? Rushed through with no safety studies. Always be cautious of anything that hasn't had the proper safety studies. Rushed through. So by the end of the 1970s, this wheat's going worldwide. So by the 1990s, every bread, cereal, cake, etc., etc., pizza, pasta is all made out of the hybridised wheat. It's only now that we are beginning to see the problems that this has caused. And what I want to show you today is what it did to the starch structure. So the starch structure that was produced in the hybridisation of the wheat is called amylopectin A. Amylopectin A is the starch that was produced in the hybridisation process. And this amylopectin A causes a massive blood sugar level rise. I'll show you. So this is where blood sugar level, that's normal blood sugar. It gets it up very high, very fast, and then there's always a corresponding drop. That's your A. In comparison, amylopectin B is found in bananas and potatoes. And if you are familiar with the glycemic index of food, The glycemic index of food is a reading on how quickly the glucose in the food is released into the blood. Bananas and potatoes, they have a very loose fibre structure under a microscope, and it quickly releases the glucose into the blood. And that's why diabetics are told, go easy on the bananas and the potatoes, because the glucose is released quickly, and when you've got a compromised pancreas, that you don't want any quick release glucoses. You're trying to heal that pancreas. So amylopectin B is found in bananas and potatoes, and it gets the blood sugar level up relatively high, relatively fast. And so, again, a corresponding drop. Amylopectin C. I like to use keys to remember things. So think of B for bananas, C for chickpeas, lentils, kidney beans, lima beans, all your legumes. You'll find amylopectin C. And those legumes give a lovely steady rise, lovely steady maintenance, lovely steady drop. What does every cell in our body want? They want this steady, sure delivery of fuel, not the quick highs, because quick highs always come with corresponding dumps. That's why William Duffy's book Sugar Blues is called Sugar Blues, because what does sugar cause? The blues. Because you get this initial high and then you get this corresponding dump. When the pancreas is constantly exposed to these quick highs and quick lows, that's what wears it out. So can you see here that this hybridized wheat of today is a big contributing factor to the diabetes we're seeing? Let me show you on the glycemic index. So glycemic index, anything under 55 is considered low GI. So all your low GI foods are great for the diabetic, because your low GI foods give a nice, steady, consistent fuel delivery. So cherries. Cherries sit at 26. All your berries are quite low, so they're a great fruit for your diabetic. Grapefruit. Grapefruit sits at 25. Not everyone likes grapefruit. Myself, I love it. But they're great fruits for the diabetic. So sugar. Where the sugar is white, trying to shut it off quickly. Yeah. A reminder, phones off please. So sugar, whether it was white, whether it was tan, whether it is brown, got that? It sits at 59. That's not a surprise. White bread. So the white wheat, we'll call it. White wheat sits at 69. Do you know what that means? A slice of white bread will get the blood sugar level up just as high, maybe even higher than a candy. And it's because of the amylopectin A that was created in the hybridization process. Remember what I said? It was rushed through with no safety studies because they thought, well, you don't need to do safety studies on wheat. The wheat went worldwide in the 70s. By the 1990s, this is all established. And you have a look at the explosion of diabetics, and that's where the explosion of diabetes began. There's about 500 new diabetics being diagnosed every day in Australia. I don't know the American figures, but I think it would be pretty close. I've just given you a moment to recover from that before I give you the next one, because the next one's shocking. Whole meal, whole grain. I think you call it whole grain or whole meal. Whole meal sits at 72. How could that be? It's because the wholemeal is not refined, it has more amylopectin A in it than the white. My husband said, Barbara, what are you saying? I've just had a lady bring me up that say, Barbara says white bread's better than brown bread. Do you know wholemeal bread is superior in the fact that it has all the B vitamins, not refined, it has the fibre. But in relation to diabetes, it has more amylopectin A in it than the white. So what do I suggest? I suggest don't eat wheat. The good news is you can still get the ancient grains that have not been hybridised. So enkhorn or enkenhorn or spelt, now they're quite free, especially the spelt. Every Trader Joe's will have spelt bread, spelt pasta, spelt. You see it everywhere. That has not been hybridised. One lady said, well, what about the organic wheat? Well, it's still been hybridised. You see that? It's still been hybridised. That explains so much. And this is why the lady, I was at our retreat a couple of years ago and I explained this. And she started to cry. I said, what's the matter? She said, I'm 69. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes when I was 65. I do everything they tell me. I have wholemeal bread. I have wholemeal pasta. I have whole wheat cereal. And every 6 months I go to the doctor, he puts me on more insulin. She said, I'm so frustrated. I do everything they tell me. And what's the definition of insanity, by the way? To do what you've always done and expect different results. I'm not criticising this lady. It's very hard when you go to the authorities that you trust and they're not lying to you. It's just that that's what they've been told. It's like my friend wanted to do a nutrition course. So she rang up the school. She said, can I have the number of one of your students? She got the student, she said, can you go to your textbook? Can you go to the back? Can you tell me who funded the study in the textbooks you're being taught in the nutrition school? Oh, the wheat industry, the grain industry, the dairy industry, the sugar. Yeah. So I'm not going to go there because we've got more important things to talk about, but can you see that money can be behind this? In Australia, we grow tons of wheat. And the farmers love the hybridised wheat because they're getting more grain, more money. They're up to their here in debt because they have to buy this huge equipment. Can you see this thing's big? For a farmer to say, I'm not going to grow wheat anymore, I'm going to grow spelt. And I'm actually going to go organic because in Australia it's not just the wheat, it's the chemicals that it's grown with, it's what it's sprayed with. It's not being fed. So you see, you get all these other problems. And then there's another problem. Because we grow so much, it's in huge silos. Cold, frosty morning, hot, sunny day, you got a bit of mould growth growing in them. And by law, they're allowed to have a certain amount of mould waste in there. Otherwise, no grain would ever pass the test. Right. One man said, Barbara, you're wrong on the wheat. He said, I eat wheat and I don't have diabetes, I don't have these problems. I said, yeah, but look at you. You're 45, you're incredibly fit, you exercise every day, and wheat is not a huge part of your diet. I eat wheat, but not much. Sometimes I go months without even eating it. But if I had any form of health problem at all, I would not touch it. It doesn't mean you never eat it. Once you conquer your health problem, you might be able to eat it occasionally. I might go out to dinner with my husband and we might have a meal of pasta and sweet pasta. But if I had diabetes, I wouldn't touch that. Have you noticed that many shops today have gluten-free pastas, have gluten-free options? Because gluten-free intolerance is huge. If we want to talk about a pandemic, there's a pandemic. Is gluten intolerance. You had a question?
What about other whole grains like millet, rye, barley, rice?
You know, they have not been hybridised. I know in Australia, I know in the US your corn has been genetically modified. So you have to, and you know what the other problem is? How many people have cereal and toast for breakfast, pasta or sandwiches for lunch, pasta for tea, cakes, 100% wheat? And yet God gave us a variety of grains. Yeah?
So if you had the spelt or the corn,
Yeah.
and made a bread with that, where would that be under glycemic index?
On the glycemic index, it probably sits fairly low, and especially if it's made into the sourdough bread. And you can Google. Well, I had some students last week that Googled glycemic index, and one glycemic index said that dates were low. The glycemic index I've got at home said dates are 92. And one glycemic said they were low, but anyway, I guess you have a look at a few glycemic index and work out the balance.
And then the spelt, does that have the same chemicals put on it when it's grown?
Not if it's organic. So if you buy spelt, it must be organic.
Okay.
Yeah. So as you just have a look at what you're confronted with if you're a farmer. It's a huge loss to actually stop growing the wheat and go over to a grain that's not going to give you near as much per acre. So it's a very confronting issue, and I recognise that. But I'm just looking at it in relation to diabetes. So this lady that was crying, she said, I'm crying because I've been so frustrated. She said, I'm crying because you've just solved the puzzle for me. It's the wheat. And so the question now is, well, why aren't the nutritionists telling diabetics to stop the wheat? So then we have to go back to who trains the nutritionists and the industries that are influencing what they're being taught. If you want to explore this a little bit more, I'm so thankful for independent doctors who have written books. And the book is called Wheat Belly. Wheat Belly by Dr. William Davis. It's a bestseller. And he shows what's happened to the wheat. And he also explains the different starches that I've just explained to you there. And he shows that in detail.
William who?
Davis. D-A-V-I-S. William Davis. He's got decades of clinical practice up his sleeve, this doctor, and he shows the changes that he saw just by stopping the wheat. When you consider the original food plan that God gave Adam and Eve, and we'll look at that original food plan. It's found in Genesis 1:29. God said, behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth. So we're going to look at the food. What's a seed? A seed is a grain. A seed is a legume. A seed is also a seed. So let's have a look at that. So the grain, wheat, rye, barley, oats, amaranth, millet, buckwheat, corn, so many grains. These grains are high in protein. That's good news. But regarding carbohydrate, they are very high. That's not right. How many here are from the grain department? Grain, 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 grain. The majority are from the grain. Another seed is a legume. What's a legume? That's your chickpeas, lima beans, black-eyed beans, cannellini beans. So many legumes. You go into an Indian shop, you get about 5 different types of just lentils. Red lentils, green lentils, blue lentils, brown lentils. Legumes are high in protein, but they are medium to low in carbohydrate. The fact is, the legume is about 1/3 the carbohydrate content that you will find in the grain. And remember, they're a nice steady low on the glycemic index. Seed. Pumpkin seed, sesame seed, sunflower seed, chia seed, high in protein, low in carbohydrate. God said, behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed. You see, what God designed was us to have a variety. And yet on this high carbohydrate diet, people are eating one grain, and that happens to be the grain that was hybridised. And the reason they hybridise that grain is because it's such a popular grain, the wheat. And because it's what people predominantly eat, so that's why they hybridised it. But not only do we have an pandemic, I'd say, of gluten intolerance, but we've also got a pandemic of obesity and diabetes. That's huge. God said, behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed and every tree, in the which of the tree is a fruit-bearing seed. So what's a fruit-bearing seed? That's a nut. And we have so many nuts. Peanut is not a nut. A peanut is a legume. And as a legume, it should be cooked, either dry roasted or boiled. And I know down in the southern states, a boiled peanut dish is a popular dish, isn't it? And there's not a problem when you grow it yourself and harvest it and process it straight away. The problem is most people are living in the cities now, so their food's grown out in the country, it's harvested, it's stored, and because peanuts are a ground crop, they mould very easy. So it's in storage that the problem arises. One of our staff, when she was a teenager, she worked in the Sanitarium health food company in Australia. It's a Seven-Day Adventist company, and they have products called nut meat, nuttolene, where they grind up peanuts and cook them and like have loaves. And she said there would be trays of nuts, there'd be almonds, big trays of peanuts. She said, so us staff, I don't think they're allowed to now, but they'd grab a few nuts when they're going to lunch. She said no one ever took the peanuts because they always had this light green covering. What's that? Mould. She said they always wash it before they grind it up. You cannot kill mould. You cannot kill it. That's why I don't touch peanuts. Now, if I hadn't eaten for a week and I was given a bowl of peanuts, I think I'd eat them. But we have choices today, don't we? And if you love peanut butter, you've got almond butter, you've got cashew butter. There's so many alternatives. The problem is the peanut is a legume. And as a legume and a ground crop, and of course in the storage, the problem arises. That's where the problem is. But we've so many nuts. We've got almonds and Brazil and hazelnut. I've just come from Germany. They make the most beautiful cake out of ground hazelnuts. Very nice. Cashews, pistachios, almonds. We've done almonds. Walnuts, macadamia nuts, and pecan, or you call them pecan, we call them pecan. So many nuts. And nuts are high in protein, low in carbohydrate. And so to get the glucose levels down, to go on a diet that's going to give a steady, sure, consistent delivery of fuel, reduce the grain part of the meal and increase the legume, seed, nut part of the meal. That's a very easy way to do it. Very easy way. So we go to the Garden of Eden diet and we can see why God said at the end of that verse, Genesis 1:29, he says, the seed to you it shall be for meat, meaning the main substance of our food. Yes?
Quinoa, does it fall in the green category or the seed category?
Well, quinoa and buckwheat are considered seeds, but they are really grains because they need cooking. Okay. Whereas an official seed does not need to be cooked. Another aspect of this, which many people don't realise, is caffeine. When caffeine goes into the body, it causes a crisis response. And that's why a person gets a lift, because it's a crisis response. And because it is a crisis response in the body releases insulin so that more glucose can get into the cell because it's a supposed crisis. So it's very important also to stop all caffeine. In the book Caffeine Blues, he's got a chapter called Coming Off the Bean. And he shows a way to come off coffee without pain and suffering. Now in Australia we have roasted cereal beverages, we have Roma, we have Nature's Cuppa. I'm sure you have them here, but I don't know what their names would be. You have Roma. Okay, we'll do Roma. So what he suggests is, say a person has 3 cups of coffee a day. The first day, when they make their cup of coffee, it's half a teaspoon of coffee, half a teaspoon of Roma. The body won't react because it's getting a little bit. The taste will be much the same. And then every day, a little bit less coffee and a little bit more Roma. And sometimes within a week, the person can be on 100% Roma and they haven't gone through pain and suffering. Because what the caffeine does, because it has a crisis response, it disrupts the neurotransmitters in the brain, which is very appropriate for a crisis, so we can do the run or the climb or the jump of our life. But actually no one's jumping or climbing or running. And that's why the body quickly says, well, they're not responding quick, and there's this adaptation process. And that's why when someone comes to a retreat and they're stopping 3 cups of coffee a day, they usually get terrible headaches because there's this sudden change. But to conquer diabetes, the caffeine must stop. Absolutely the refined sugar must stop. What about honey? What about maple syrup? What about your coconut sugars? When the pancreas isn't working well, you've got to go very light on all sugars until the pancreas starts working well. Probably the only sweet that doesn't really get an insulin response is stevia. And stevia is a plant sweetener. In fact, it's often called a sweet leaf. We used to grow it, and you eat that leaf, it's just so sweet. In fact, my grandchildren after the meal would say, Grandma, can we go and get a sweet leaf? And they'd chew on the sweet leaf. And you buy it as a powder, so it's a little bit refined, but it still doesn't have the same effect of sugar. 1/16 of a teaspoon of stevia is equal to 2 teaspoons of sugar. That's incredible, isn't it? And that's hard to believe. So most people use too much and then it gets a bitter aftertaste. So if someone says to me, I don't like stevia, I say, you've used too much. Because if you use just the right amount, it's a lovely, delicate sweetener, and you do not get that bitter aftertaste. Yes?
Do you feel like sugar is an addiction in the brain?
Sugar is an addiction in the brain because it gets this high, and humans get addicted to the highs, but there's a corresponding dump because it can't keep that high. And so with the dump, then the person goes for another one.
It's like 2 weeks to get rid of it?
If you do 2 days juices, you can cut it very quickly. If you do a 2-day juice fast and then go on to a sugar-free diet, we have so many guests say to us, you know, they go home and they say, I can't believe it, I haven't got my sugar cravings anymore. See, the more carbs you eat, the more sugars you eat, the more wheat you eat, the more you will crave it. So once it stops, the craving stops.
The stevia is 1/16 equals is the same as 2 tablespoons of
Yeah, it's a very high sweet. And no one can believe that, so they use too much and then it has the bitter aftertaste and they say, oh, I don't like stevia.
Is high fructose corn syrup worse than the sugar addiction?
Is high fructose corn syrup worse? Oh dear, that's a hard question. So the answer to that is, how do you want to die? They're both dangerous. They're both nasty. So I'd like to quickly put our Sustain Me for diabetes and show you how this can be applied to conquer diabetes. Sunshine, we must have that for our vitamin D, to get our minerals. Use of water. When you have water between meals, it maintains blood glucose levels. Many people that feel they've got to eat between meals, it's thirst. And one lady said to me, my little 9-year-old girl's a type 1 diabetic. She said, and we're told to give her little snacks between the meals, but we've never given our children snacks. And we give her a snack, but all the other children complain because she's got something to eat. Why can't they have something to eat? And I said to her, try a little bit of salt with water between the meals. 2 days later, she contacted me. She said, it's working. She said that little bit of salt with the water between meals is maintaining her blood glucose levels. So use of water, meaning keep the meals a distance apart. With our diabetics, we give them breakfast like a king, we give them lunch like a queen, and at night we just give them broth. And you know their blood sugar levels balance out. You've heard of time-restricted eating. I've spoken about it a couple of times. Time-restricted eating is eating twice in a 24-hour period, 6 hours apart. Do you know what they're finding? Diabetics' blood sugar levels are being balanced by eating 2 meals a day. And what have we been told for the last 40 years? Diabetics have to eat every 2 hours. That makes no sense because the stomach is constantly being interrupted and it's not being able to digest properly, so you're not getting the nutrients out of your food. The fact is, when your stomach's empty, do you remember what I showed you? I think it was yesterday. Our nutrients are predominantly being absorbed in our small intestine. So when the stomach's empty, your cells are still getting nutrients from the small intestine. So drinking water, ideally 8 glasses of water. Now I have to do some adjustments in my brain, so we'll say 1 quart of water to 50 pound. That's a nice incentive to lose weight, isn't it? So that's approximately, now if you're 200 pound and you're thinking, I can't drink that much water, you don't have to drink that much water straight away. You ease into it. You ease into it. If a person's 150 pound and they're drinking 1 quart of water a day, that's 4 glasses. Start drinking 5 glasses. As the days go by, go to 6. Can you see how you just slowly build up to it? You just do what you can. Sleep. Tonight's coming. Tonight's coming where I will show you that it is particularly in the early hours of the night that healing accelerates. Particularly between the hours of, at the moment, it is 10 and 3 a.m. That's when the body is at its peak in healing the body. So to heal the pancreas, we need to go to bed early and have 8 hours. If you're not used to 8 hours, again, you can train your body into those 8 hours. Trust in divine power. Stress. When we're stressed, it interferes with blood glucose levels. When we're stressed, it's like the body thinks the body's in a crisis, and so more insulin's released, more glucose is trying to get into the cell. So we've got to keep calm. And last night I showed you how breathing very deeply, remember God's LSD, low, slow, deep, through the nose, in and out of the nose. Abstain. To conquer diabetes, the specifics to abstain from is wheat. The specifics to abstain from is sugar, caffeine. These must stop to conquer diabetes. Inhale through the nose. Inhaling through the nose means more oxygen's available for the cell, which means every cell in the pancreas is going to get 18 times more energy, which means it's going to be able to start producing the hormones in the pancreas more effectively. Nutrition. We've looked a few times at the 3 essential food groups. Fibre. Fibre slowly releases the glucose, and that's what the diabetic wants. Protein. The legumes, the nuts and the seeds, low GI, all of them. Fats. I have read some articles claiming that fats are causing diabetes. There are fats that heal and there are fats that kill. So the healing fats are the fats found in your nuts, your seeds, your avocados, your coconuts. And the 2 fats that have been predominantly used for centuries in countries where they'd never heard of diabetes is the coconut oil and the olive oil. So what are the killer fats? The killer fats are the altered fats. They're the fried foods, the deep fried foods, the fried foods that have been fried in your polyunsaturated fats that are already altered because they've been extracted with heat and chemicals and destroyed. Those are the killer fats, the altered fats. Also animal fats from animals that have been exposed to many chemicals. I was driving around with a man in Ireland a couple of years ago, and he's in his 80s now, but he said, I used to be a dairy farmer. I cannot believe the amount of antibiotics we used to give those cows. So that would have been in the 60s. Has it improved? Now, do you know 80% of antibiotics made today go to animals? I said, why did you give them so many antibiotics? He said, well, the udders were so full of milk that it put pressure on their hooves, and their hooves had split. And when their hooves split, so what's going to happen whenever there's cell damage, students? Then the white blood cells come along, the neutrophils pass. So we said we just used to give them so many antibiotics. And what's happening to the people that are eating the milk and the cheese, and see how it goes down the line. Moderation. Moderation in all good things. When we overeat, that is another cause of too much glucose going into the blood. Exercise. The exercise that predominantly helps with this is the high intensity interval training. And we're going to look at heart health in a minute, where I'll be defining that. And that is exercise that has intervals of high intensity, intervals of recovery. Most research for this has been done on the exercise bike, because the person can hold on, they can go for it, rest, go for it, rest. What that does, that causes a bit of a crisis in the body because you're running for your life. But it's a crisis that causes the body to start functioning more effectively and efficiently. And what it efficiently and effectively does is develop extra receptor sites for insulin. So if someone's got insulin resistance, they can turn that around in a week. All they need to do is get those carbohydrates and those sugars down, start eating a high fibre, high protein, or generous protein, healthy fats, and implement the exercise program and have water between meals, and the cell actually develops extra receptor sites for insulin. What an amazing body we live in. Tonight we're going to be looking at weight loss. In our next lecture we're going to be looking at heart disease. When we look at weight loss, the presentation will be similar to this, but there will be certainly other factors coming into play. But you can see how this helps. So I'm going to finish with a story of a man who came to a retreat that we did in Alabama about 8 years ago. When he came to us, he was in a wheelchair. He was 62. We'll call him Tom. The reason he was in a wheelchair is because he had diabetes. He was on 90 units of insulin a day. He's a type 1 diabetic. And they'd recently taken his lymph nodes out of his groin to try and find out why he had diabetes. So when he flew to Atlanta, the legs swelled. So when he came to us, he was just about in a wheelchair. He said, I'm the CEO of some big companies, but he said, I've had to basically step back. He said, I'm on blood pressure medication, I'm on statin medication, I'm on blood thinning medication. We'll look at all those after the break. He said, I'm on 90 units of insulin a day. He said, my life is miserable. My wife, who's 42, is complaining that I've turned into a grumpy old man. See, when the blood sugar levels are constantly going up and down, how's the mood when the blood sugar level's low? Ooh. How long does it take before the brain hasn't got fuel? 2 minutes. No wonder they're irritable. He said, the doctors have just told me they can do no more for me. He said, I'm a wealthy man. I get the top specialists. And they've just told me they can do no more for me. He said, I was lying around my pool in Florida and I started talking to a lady. And we talked about my health and she said, I think I know someone that can help you. So he said, I booked into the first retreat. I've just booked the plane and I'm here. Anything you tell me to do, I will do. She said, I've just spent $800 on these bandages for my legs. I said, you won't need those. But I said, I want you to get on the rebounder for 1 minute every hour and just do this. That's all he did, was this. No leaping yet, just this. That's how you start the rebounder. Real slow and ease your body into it. Because the rebounder stimulates the lymphatic system and these swollen legs were lymphatic fluid. I said, I want you to walk barefoot on the grass, just where the grass is very soft. He had the 2 days of juices and then he went breakfast like a king, lunch like a queen. We gave him a protein drink at night because if he was still on too much insulin, his blood sugar levels will drop. At the end of 2 weeks, he was on 10 units of insulin a day. Type 1 diabetic. 62, not a young man. He'd stopped his statin, he'd stopped his blood thinner, he was on a little bit of blood pressure medication. He went home and he continued to eat like this. He emailed me 3 months later, he said, I am off all my medication. He said, in 3 months, I've lost 45 pounds. I said, this is impressive, Tom. Tell me what your exercise program is. He said, I cycle 6 miles a day. I swim 30 laps of the pool a day. I do 3 minutes rebounding 3 times a day. They're the only exercises he can do because he's lost his lymph nodes. And if he's on his feet too much, those legs will swell. But he manages it by doing that type of exercise. He said, I'm doing exactly what you said. I'm on a plant-based diet now. He said, when I went home, my wife said, I'm not interested in this. This is your baby. I like my croissants, my champagne. He said, after 3 months, she's interested. She hasn't got a grumpy old man as a husband anymore. He's gone back to full-time work. He went into the office and said, watch out, I'm back. He said, my doctors are astonished. Type 1 diabetic. What an incredible body we have. He said to me, I will be one of your success stories because he said, anything you tell me to do, I will do. He emailed me 5 months later. He said, I've lost more weight. He said, I feel better now than I even felt in my 40s. He said, my wife has lost 20 kilos. Oh, sorry, 20 pounds, 10 kilos. He said, she's very happy because all her girlfriends are saying, what happened to you? What expensive supplement are you on? What expensive program are you on? Don't you love the way it is so simple? Don't you love the way there is no great cost in all of this? It's just an adjustment change. Because I am the one that chooses what I do to my body. And Tom was right. He's an amazing success story. Does he still live like that? I don't know. The choice is his. But he knows with the problems he had and with the loss of his lymph nodes, he needs to keep his eye on this for the rest of his life. And one day, we will see Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven and we'll all be totally cured. Yes. But until then, it's a management program. So we're going to have a break now. We're going to have a 15-minute break, and we're going to come back at 10:30, and we're going to look at heart disease.